Over the weekend, Kamala Harris kicked off her 2020 presidential campaign with a rally in Oakland, and this event attracted thousands of participants. And I think that she made it very clear that she is no candidate to sleep on, and the reason why I view her as a threat, as a progressive, is because she has managed, thus far at least, to kind of carve out this space for herself within the Democratic Party primary field, in which she is able to appeal to the establishment wing of the party, but also extend an olive branch to the progressive left and Bernie Sanders supporters, something that Hillary Clinton did not do in 2016. So she reminds me of a more charismatic, pseudo-populist version of Hillary Clinton that is exponentially more politically astute, because it's very clear Kamala Harris knows what she's doing, and it's not too surprising why many people were captivated by her speech, because she not only preached unity and used the flowery rhetoric and platitudes that a lot of other establishment Democrats love to use, but she also did try to cater to progressives by talking about every American having the right to join a union, Medicare for all, and universal pre-K. So it's very clear to me that she is a skilled politician. The problem, though, with Kamala Harris is that even if she is incredibly charismatic and she's talking about the right issues, so this is all the makings of a fantastic candidate, the problem is that people don't know that if you just do a quick 5-minute Google search, you will learn that she is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now, the reason why I say this is not because I just want to shit on Kamala Harris, but she is, like many Democrats, tied to Wall Street. Additionally, when she was California's Attorney General and her department determined that Steve Mnuchin, head of One West Bank at the time, had committed more than 1,000 instances of fraud, she chose to not prosecute him. And then, come to find out, she was accepting campaign contributions from him throughout the years. But with that being said, in addition to those issues, last week I did a 25-minute segment where I detailed her record as a prosecutor, and there were a ton of blemishes on her record. First of all, there's all the wrongful convictions that she defended. Second of all, there's the issue of her defending the use of prison slave labor. And additionally, there are various anecdotes that demonstrate she's not too progressive, because she always tried to frame this discussion about her tenure as a prosecutor as her being a progressive prosecutor. But I mean, when you look at instances where she stepped in to tell a transgender inmate that she does not deserve gender confirmation surgery, that's something where you just kind of have to step back and say, this is not something a progressive prosecutor would do. Now, one of the biggest blemishes on her record that I touched on last week but didn't get too deep into the details of was her decision as a prosecutor to aggressively enforce truancy laws to the point where she would literally prosecute the parents of kids who have multiple unexcused absences and fees. Now, the reason why this practice in particular is morally indefensible is because it disproportionately affects poor communities, especially communities of color. And while we all agree that children should be in school, Kamala Harris failed to ask the question, why aren't these children in school? And rather than looking at this issue as a socioeconomic issue, she chose to look at this as a criminal issue. She chose to prosecute the parents of children who aren't attending school. And in a video that recently surfaced from 2010, where she spoke to the Commonwealth Club, she said some things about her decision to pursue parents of truant children that really were disturbing. So take a look, and I'm going to tell you why she's wrong here.
I would not be standing here were it not for the education I received. And I know many of us will say the same thing. And I believe a child going without an education is tantamount to a crime. So I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy. Well, this was a little controversial in San Francisco. And frankly, my staff went bananas. They were very concerned because we didn't know at the time whether I was going to have an opponent in my re-election race. But I said, look, I'm done. This is a serious issue, and I've got a little political capital, and I'm going to spend some of it. And this is what we did. We recognized that in that initiative, as a prosecutor and law enforcement, I have a huge stick. The school district has got a carrot. Let's work in tandem around our collective objective and goal, which is to get those kids in school. So, to that end, on my letterhead, now let me tell you something about my letterhead. When you're the DA of a major city in this country, usually the job comes with a badge. And there is often an artistic rendering of said badge on your stationery. So I sent a letter out on my letterhead to every parent in the school district, outlining the connection that was statistically proven between elementary school truancy, high school dropouts, who will become a victim of crime, and who will become a perpetrator of crime. We sent it out to everyone. A friend of mine actually called me and he said, Kamala, my wife got the letter. She freaked out. She brought all the kids into the living room, held up the letter, said, if you don't go to school, Kamala's going to put you and me in jail. Yes.
Yeah, to me, that is just unacceptable. Because if you are going to be a leader on the left, then you need to be especially sensitive to the issues facing our country's most vulnerable communities. And instead of asking the question, why are these children having a difficult time attending school? Is there any underlying behavioral issues that need to be addressed? Is there income disparities in these communities where they are, they're more absent? What's the issue? Instead of trying to look at the issue, she chose to prosecute the parents of children who were truant. Now, the reason why she mishandled this situation in a fundamental way is because, as Dana Goldstein points out in an article for New Republic, quote, getting tough on truancy doesn't help students get an education, and it unfairly attacks the poor. Now, what this article attempts to do is bring some much-needed understanding to the situation, because rather than just characterizing the parents of truant children as criminals and looking at them as the bad guys, well, maybe we should be asking why their kids aren't showing up to school. Now, keep in mind that these truancy laws are going to range depending on the state and district, and some of these are incredibly harsh. So, I mean, if you just have 3 unexcused absences, that can result in a fine. So this story makes me think about how these laws can really be misused to make the poor even worse off than they already are. Because think about this. If you have just 3 unexcused absences and you're already poor and you start racking up fines, then what does that do? That makes a family who's poor even more poor, because now they have to dole out money for these fines, but in many instances, they can't pay these fines because they're poor. So if you rack up so many fines, then what happens? Well, then you get arrested and you go to jail. But that also compounds the situation, because if you go to jail and you're unable to go to work, then you may be fired from your job. You may not have enough money because you missed work, and your paycheck will be shorter. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, then, I mean, this is clearly something that is not going to help the situation. And when you choose to prosecute them for not paying these fines and throw them in jail, at that point, I think it's safe to say that you're just being cruel. Now, as Goldstein explains in this article, absence from school is an undeniable problem. We know it is correlated with lower grades and dropping out of high school, and with trouble with the law. What is less certain is if treating truancy as crime addresses these underlying issues in an effective and reasonable way. Such interventions have not been proven to increase school attendance or decrease long-term criminal behavior. In fact, the criminalization of truancy often pushes students further away from school and their families deeper into poverty. Our courts are not very good at getting kids back into class. Research demonstrates that although truancy proceedings can increase a child's school attendance in the short term, answering to a judge for school absence does not help students graduate high school or avoid crime. A 2011 study from the Washington State Center for Court Research compared high school students who received truancy summons with kids who had the same number of unexcused absences and similar grades, but who were not called into court. The students in court experienced more subsequent absences than the ones who avoided law enforcement. They also received lower grades and were more likely to drop out of school or be charged with a crime. Now, to be fair to Kamala, the results from this particular study came out a year after she made that speech to the Commonwealth Club, but you have to understand that just generally speaking, as a broad rule for prosecutors, anytime you choose to use your resources and prosecutorial discretion to go after the poor, you've got to expect there to be adverse consequences. And for whatever reason, Kamala Harris had a blind spot in this area. Now, these types of harsh truancy laws have been pushed in states across the country, as I alluded to earlier, and they became a lot more prevalent ever since George W. Bush passed his No Child Left Behind Act. And as Goldstein points out in the article, some education advocates are actually worried that the crackdown on truancy is an indirect way to improve test scores. Because think about this, if funding for schools hinges specifically on test scores, and there's supposedly this link, or theoretically there's this link between absence and lower test scores, then by prosecuting the parents of truant students, then that will oftentimes lead to these students being taken out of public schools and being placed in alternative forms of education. Now, what does that do? You in turn remove them from the standardized testing pool in hopes of increasing the average scores so that district won't lose crucial resources. This isn't something that's confirmed, even though it sounds really, nefarious and almost is cartoonishly evil. But I mean, education advocates are concerned about this, that this may be the agenda, or at least incentivized, because they have a reason to be cynical. These public schools are being starved of resources. So in a way, it kind of incentivizes a crackdown on these truancy laws if they think it's going to help them improve overall scores, so that way they can get more funding. So I mean, you kind of have some background now about why this is so problematic. And the way that Kamala Harris spoke about this issue in, I think, a flippant way, it really showed that she doesn't grasp how harmful this was. She made it seem as if, by the way, her move to prosecute parents would be simply controversial because, well, there's just some people that disagree with her. No, it's not controversial because it's a debatable issue. It's controversial because you are choosing to inflict harm on communities because of your misguided approach to education. Rather than focusing on this as a socioeconomic issue, you chose to treat this as a criminal issue. But the problem with Kamala Harris is that she isn't very aware of the issues that vulnerable communities are facing, not just in the United States, but around the world, because that wasn't the only video from her that resurfaced recently that kind of is incriminating of Kamala Harris, because she gave a speech at AIPAC in 2017 and she talked about how she was unequivocally supportive of Israel, made no mention of Palestinian human rights.
In the midst of uncertainty and turmoil, America's support for Israel's security must be rock solid. And as Iran continues to launch ballistic missiles, while it arms and funds its terrorist proxy Hezbollah, we must stand with Israel. As Hamas maintains its control of Gaza and fires rockets across Israel's southern border, we must stand with Israel. And as ISIS and civil war in Syria destabilize the region, displacing millions and threatening shared security interests, we must support all those affected by ongoing violence and terror, and we must stand with Israel. Our defense relationship is critical to both nations, which is why I support the United States' commitment to provide Israel with $38 billion in military assistance over the next decade. It is why I support full funding for Israel, including for the Arrow, David Sling, and the Iron Dome missile defense systems, which save lives. And that's why I am fully committing to maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge.
So you saw her condemn Hamas for their violent actions, firing rockets off into Israel, which we don't support, but she made no mention of Israel's 2014 incursion into Gaza, made no mention of the numerous human rights abuses of Palestinians, made no mention of the fact that Palestinians are treated as second-class citizens in Israel, made no mention of the fact that the far-right Israeli government continues to build settlements on Palestinian land. So, I mean, this is just kind of another video that lends evidence to the claim that Kamala Harris really has this blind spot when it comes to the issues that vulnerable communities face. She's often quick to point to the criminality involved in these issues, but she doesn't actually look at these issues in a nuanced way. And this is an issue that she's going to have to come to terms with if she wants to win the Democratic Party nomination, because you can speak in platitudes if you want. You can invoke policies like Medicare for all, which you should do, by the way, but you can invoke those policies in an attempt to court progressives. But unless you actually explain to us that as president, you're going to stand up for our country and the world's most vulnerable communities, then you're not progressive. You're just pretending to be a progressive.
You could support the Humanist Report at patreon.com/Humanist Report. But trust me, I'd have way more supporters on Patreon if that was my podcast. Sad.